The God of Mischief is back, and he remembers none of his character development past his first bout with the Avengers. In the latest Marvel show on Disney+, our old pal finds himself apprehended by the Time Variance Authority, all with the intent of fixing the mess he's made by stealing the Tesseract. And as you can expect from a show that's planning to jump around the timeline of a massive franchise, there's gonna be plenty of Easter eggs for us to sniff out. Well, let's get started. You just can't introduce time travel to any franchise without eventually getting some kind of time police involved. This time, they're called the Time Variance Authority, TVA for short. And surprise, surprise, they are not a unique invention of the show. They do indeed originate from the comics. But while they do share similarities with their comic book counterpart, the TVA in the show actually seems to have the opposite end goal. Where this group of unique individuals work to prevent timelines from branching off and a multiverse from being created, the TVA in the comics consists mostly of identical clones specifically bred to keep tabs on the multiverse and all of its realities. Gee, I wonder if this might possibly play into a certain upcoming Doctor Strange film. Segueing flawlessly into this entry, there may already be sneaky references to a potential villain for Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness. Take a closer look at that pack of gum that Mobius finds in 1500s France, and notice the blue face on the packaging. It does bear a bit of resemblance to the Marvel villain Nightmare, ruler of the Nightmare realm within the Dream dimensions in the comics. Considering that Mobius alludes to another department when Loki calls the TVA a nightmare, and that the villain actually has a bit of history with Loki from back in his Kid Loki days, this is definitely worth keeping an eye on. Much like the TVA, the Timekeepers are indeed also from the comics. And they're drawn in an impressively accurate 1960s Marvel Comics style. In the comics, the Timekeepers were created by a being known as He Who Remains, the last living director of the TVA, shortly before the end of the last multiverse. Before his death, he created a different group called Time Twisters to guide our new multiverse, only for them to end up causing a lot of chaos instead. Now, it was Thor who intervened here and told He Who Remains what had happened, leading instead to the creation of the Timekeepers. Though this also means that two more timelines were created, one where the Time Twisters died and were replaced by the Timekeepers, and one where the Time Twisters kept sticking around I think I need to lie down for a moment. While the TVA in the comics does largely consist of clones, there do exist a few unique characters within it, and of course, they make it into the show as well. Most prominently, we have Agent Mobius, who is played by none other than Mr. Wow himself, Owen Wilson. As Executive Senior Manager of the TVA, Mobius M. Mobius, Moby to his friends, was first introduced getting on the Fantastic Four's case, accusing them of a number of time crimes, though the group managed to escape their charges. He also served as judge in a famous She-Hulk story where she messed with the timeline by warning Hawkeye of his coming death. Who knows, Mobius might just show up again whenever those Hawkeye and She-Hulk series come around. But we're not quite done with the TVA's employees just yet. The judge that Loki is brought before during his time in TVA custody is actually credited as yet another comics character, Ravonna Renslayer. What's significant about this is that in the comics, Ravonna was the daughter of King Corellius, who ruled in an alternate 40th century Earth, which just so happens to be one of the few civilizations spared by the time-traveling supervillain Kang the Conqueror, since he had a thing for Princess Renslayer. Oh, and in case you forgot, Kang is slated to appear in the upcoming Ant-Man film Ant-Man Quantumania. Man, are there any future MCU projects this show isn't connected to? Oh, never mind. This is a time travel show. It's a stupid question. Now, we all have our vices. Some people smoke. Some people chew nightmare gum. And Agent Mobius drinks energy drinks. Discontinued energy drinks, that is. More specifically, the drink we see him open and that he offers Loki a sip of is actually a can of Josta, which was the first major energy drink introduced in the US in 1995. It even had a commercial where an older man tells his past self to do the good stuff now while he's young, which seems apt for a show about time travel. Josta was discontinued in 1999, but hey, being a time traveler clearly has its perks. Now this one is probably here just for fun, but after Loki gets arrested and the Tesseract confiscated, you can at one point hear a TVA employee referring to him as a criminal with a blue box.
I know you. You're that criminal with the blue box.
Now, if you enjoy time travel fiction, this probably sounds similar to another famous time traveler with a blue box that the resident time police aren't overly fond of. Namely, the Doctor and their iconic TARDIS, almost always seen in the shape of a blue British 1960s police box. I don't see Loki handing out jelly babies or trying on fezzes anytime soon, though. Now, just in case you forgot that Loki is the god of mischief, Mobius is kind enough to show us footage of an old memory where Loki hijacks a plane and steals $200,000 back in 1971 due to losing a bet with Thor. But this, and the name D.B. Cooper, is not something Marvel made up just to show Loki messing around. D.B. Cooper was the pseudonym of a real person who really did hijack a plane, demand a sum of $200,000, and parachute off the plane once he got what he wanted. The real D.B. Cooper was never found or identified after his daring caper either, so it all lines up with Loki's shenanigans pretty neatly. Though I wonder what kind of bets he and Thor were making back then that requires hijacking a freaking plane. Anyone who works in any kind of bureaucracy can nod in agreement when Mobius talks about endless paperwork, but it's actually worth paying attention to some of it in this episode. Loki's arrest form is full of interesting details, like listing his sex as fluid, referring to his time spent as Lady Loki in the comics. It also lists his native time sector as 1900 to 2099, referring to the 2099 line of Marvel comics that sprung up in the 90s, featuring new characters taking up the legacy of several Marvel superheroes. And the tape of Loki's memories is labeled as ETH-616. Just a random number, right? Nope. In the comics, where the multiverses are categorized by numbers, Earth-616 just so happens to be the prime Marvel Comics universe that we all know. Guess Mobius isn't kidding when he says he's a fan. Alright, don't get too comfortable sitting around being amused at the sight of Loki working a desk job at a branch of reality that doesn't give a toss about his trickster ways now. There's still another far more dangerous Loki variant on the loose, and it's up to the dream team of our Loki and Agent Mobius to file through the details of the sacred timeline to find him. And as we all know, the more you dig into something, the more likely you are to spot interesting details. Like, say, Easter eggs in an episode of a TV series based on a decades-long comic book franchise. And those are exactly what we're gonna put out in this video. Yes, flawless segue. Okay, so opening the episode with a bunch of TVA agents intruding on a Renaissance fair is probably just meant to be a little joke at the expense of time travel as a whole, but choosing to set this fair specifically in Oshkosh, Wisconsin most certainly is not. Instead, it is actually a shout-out to Marvel writer Mark Gruenwald, who is famous for creating a handful of Captain America characters that you should all be familiar with by now. Because those characters are none other than the US Agent, Battlestar, and the Flag Smasher, most recently featured in the previous MCU Disney Plus series Falcon and the Winter Soldier. In fact, this reference goes further, as Agent Mobius' appearance in the comic books, and by extension Owen Wilson's appearance in the series, was based specifically on Gruenwald to begin with. Oh, and the importance of Oshkosh in terms of Marvel doesn't quite stop there. In-universe, Oshkosh also happens to be the childhood home of one Wendell Vaughn, the first man to go by the superhero moniker of Quasar. Think we should be on the lookout for a Quasar movie trailer? Among the inspirations for the detective aspects of the show, David Fincher's dark 90s crime thriller Seven has been cited a few times thus far. And during a press conference close to the series premiere, series director Kate Herron told viewers to be on the lookout for a more specific reference in episode 2. Well, sure enough, we found it. When Loki is poring over files at the TVA and tries to get the apathetic librarian to help, the music she's listening to is Johann Sebastian Bach's Orchestral Suite No. 3 in D major. The exact same bit of classical music that's heard when Brad Pitt and Morgan Freeman's characters in Seven are doing their own bit of research on the gruesome, 7 deadly sins-obsessed serial killer that they're chasing. Apparently, there's just something about Bach's music that helps investigators get into the minds of deranged killers. Huh, I wonder how Bach would feel about that. Let's borrow a TVA time portal and go ask him. Putting some of those deduction skills to use that he has no doubt learned from centuries of scamming and manipulating people, Loki eventually figures out that the variant he and Agent Mobius are hunting seems to be hanging out shortly before catastrophic events at various times in history. Thus, he ends up dragging Mobius to Pompeii shortly before the eruption at Mount Vesuvius, which famously destroyed the city. However, the real Easter egg here happens when Loki, in order to demonstrate that divergent actions in the past have no consequence close to major disasters, without ruining Mobius's lunch this time, starts loudly foretelling the future to everyone that will listen, all in Latin. This isn't necessarily Loki flexing some unknown linguistics degree, though. If we go by the comics, it's most likely Loki demonstrating an innate Asgardian ability known as the All-Speak, which ensures that anything an Asgardian says is understood by the listener in their native tongue, be that a dead language or even an alien one. It hasn't come up much in the movies, and it certainly has not been name-dropped, but it seems slightly more likely than Loki taking the time out of his schedule to go study Latin between screwing around with the Asgardians and trying to take over the Earth. Cross-referencing Loki's theory about the variant hiding near major historical disasters and the pack of gum Mobius found last episode, the two quickly deduce that one of variant Loki's hiding places must be at a mall called Roxcart in the year 2050, when that gum was sold. Now, Marvel fans are likely to stop and take a second look once they see the name Rox, since it refers to the Roxxon Energy Corporation, which has been lurking in the background of Marvel Comics ever since its introduction back in 1974. It has even made its presence known in the live-action Marvel productions before. More specifically, they've been referenced in Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., Daredevil, Iron Fist, Runaways, as well as all 3 Iron Man films, and the corporation played a major antagonistic role in the first season of Cloak and Dagger. Being a general send-up to unscrupulous mega-corporations in real life, Roxxon tends to be depicted as a company that puts its own profit margin above anything else, engaging in all sorts of morally questionable activities that constantly brings them into conflict with just about every corner of the Marvel superhero community. Many costumed criminals have worked for them too, such as the Killer Shrike, Manticore, and Tarantula, to name a few, along with the original comic book versions of MCU villains Ghost and Flag Smasher. As for what connection Roxxon has with Loki specifically, though, allow me to introduce their most recent CEO, Dario Agger, possibly better known as the supervillain called Minotaur, one of the more recent additions to Thor's Rogues Gallery in the comics. Because when our beloved Thunder God runs out of Norse gods and monsters to fight, we bring in someone based on Greek mythology. Sure, why not? What, you thought the TVA was kidding when they said variants can be very different from their sacred timeline counterparts? Well, they weren't, no matter how funny glimpses at stuff like Tour de France Loki or what appears to be some kind of Loki Hulk might be. And the God of Mischief most certainly learns that once he finally corners his alternative self and learns that this other Loki is a woman. A lady Loki, if you will. Now, this isn't just the show having fun with variants, though, as the comics version of Loki really did get reborn as a woman sometime after Ragnarok. No, not the MCU Ragnarok, the comics Ragnarok. Come on, try to keep up. Of course, Loki is a shapeshifter, and the mythological Loki was no stranger to switching sex when he felt like it, but this is still a bit of a surprise, if a welcome and interesting one. Or, at least, all of this is what I would say if we could be sure that this is Lady Loki at all. But there are signs that point elsewhere. First of all, she's blonde, while Lady Loki had black hair in the comics, just like male Loki usually does. Granted, this might mean nothing at all, what with the whole shapeshifter thing, but the blonde hair and possession powers may be a sign that she's not actually Lady Loki, but the Marvel supervillainess known as Enchantress. Or, more specifically, she's probably the second Enchantress, Sylvie Lushton, who was given her powers by Loki in the comics. Just take a look at those case files Loki pores over, and notice that they're reporting on a variant named Sylvie Laufeyson. And of course, reading the Castilian credits presents an even more damning bit of evidence, as her Spanish voice actress, Elisa Buter, is credited as playing not Lady Loki, not the variant, but Sylvie. Man, you really do have to pay attention to the paperwork. After 2 episodes, a shocking revelation, and a leap into the nearest TVA time portal, here we are at the halfway point of Marvel's latest Disney Plus series, Loki. The Trickster God and his timeline-displaced variant find themselves trapped on the soon-to-be completely destroyed moon of Lamentis 1. The result is a solid 40 minutes of pure teeth-gritted teamwork between Tricksters, and a few Easter eggs for us to pick out. So settle in, try not to think too hard about imminent doom, and enjoy the egg hunt. What is a Marvel Studios production without at least a few callbacks to the movies that came before it? This franchise is so big by now that there is plenty to look back on and reference, poke fun of, or repeat, and Thor's branch of the MCU is no exception. I mean, let's not pretend that it isn't pretty funny to see that Thor and Loki, the adoptive brothers that they are, do have some similarities, as demonstrated when Loki repeats Thor's awesome "another" gag from the first Thor movie.
This drink, I like it.
I know, it's great, right?
Another! Another!
But there is another fun little Thor callback to spot. Back when Marvel was teasing Thor Ragnarok, the trailers included this one pretty awesome shot of Loki twirling his daggers as he got ready to fight. But for whatever reason, that particular shot never actually made it into the full movie. Well, never fear, Loki has his daggers back in this show and gets to not only twirl them in a shot that works as a deliberate shout out to this unused shot, but also use them in combat. Well, when he isn't too busy bungling up metaphors with them, that is. Look, give our boy a break. He's had a rough few days at the TVA, assuming they even register time in days the way that we do on the real world, and oh boy, this is making my head spin. Could you twirl your daggers some more, Loki? Oh yeah, that's the ticket. So as it turns out, Loki jumping through that portal to follow the variant wasn't the smartest of ideas. Not only does the ensuing fight, fun as it is to watch, end up breaking the temp pad, which makes returning to the TVA impossible, it also manages to get both of them stuck on the inhabited moon of Lamentis 1 in the year 2077, mere hours before the actual planet of Lamentis is set to collide with it. Talk about absolutely rotten luck. Now, Marvel being Marvel, they obviously didn't just come up with a new name for a planet or its moon for this episode. Why would they when Marvel's space is as immense as it is and has plenty of planets to choose from? Although, the word lament does mean expression of great sorrow, so even if it was a new name, it would actually fit a soon-to-die moon pretty well. No, instead, Lamentis is actually the name of a small planet found at the outskirts of the interstellar Kree Empire. You know, that race Ronan belongs to, who created the Inhumans and really likes to produce blatant propaganda that paints all MCU Skrulls as totally irredeemable barbarians? Yeah, that Kree Empire. Lamentis itself only appeared once, in the prologue to the comics event Annihilation Conquest, when Phyla Vell, one of several characters going by the superhero name of Quasar, assisted in rebuilding the planet after it was devastated by the Annihilation Wave. Huh, didn't the show already reference Quasar in the last episode by setting the opening scene in Wendell Vaughn's hometown of Oshkosh, Wisconsin? Either Kate Herron is a massive Quasar fan, or Marvel is planning something with the character and being way more sneaky about it than usual. Or maybe I'm just overthinking some simple quick shoutouts. Yeah, that's totally also an option. Okay, so maybe this would have made for a more shocking reveal if Disney hadn't kinda, sorta, maybe accidentally tipped their hand in the credits of the last episode, but all the same, this one confirms it. The Loki variant that the TVA has been chasing is not simply Lady Loki as fans had predicted, instead she's a character named Sylvie. And while so far the show seems to imply that she is simply a female version of Loki that chose to change her name, this is worth noting since in the comic books, Sylvie is a whole separate character. More specifically, Sylvie Lushton was the second woman to take up the supervillain identity of Enchantress, previously held by the Asgardian Amora, known for her skills in magic, mind manipulation, and seduction. But in the comics, after certain events led to the Asgardians relocating from Asgard to Oklahoma of all places, a teenage girl named Sylvie suddenly woke up with magical powers similar to Amora's, prompting her to move to New York to make it as a superhero using her name and likeness. But here's where things get juicy. As it turns out, her powers were actually given to her by Lady Loki, who muses that she enjoyed the idea of creating a mortal who suspects that she's Asgardian, and later events further imply that Sylvie was outright created by Loki rather than simply being granted superpowers. So far, it's unclear which of these origins are the truth, and there's no telling yet how it will relate to the MCU version, especially as she appears to be a fair bit older than her comic book counterparts. Oh, and also, Sylvie was, if very briefly, a member of the Young Avengers. So now we can lump her right in with Cassie Lang from the Ant-Man films, Billy and Tommy from WandaVision, and Eli from The Falcon and the Winter Soldier on the list of Young Avengers shoutouts the MCU have given us so far. And we know that Kate Bishop is slated to appear in the upcoming Hawkeye show, so here's hoping. Well, if you're going to be stuck together on a moon that's about to be destroyed and kill every single inhabitant on it regardless of any escape attempts, you might as well spend some time getting to know each other, right? As Loki and Sylvie discuss each other's romantic exploits, Sylvie briefly jokes that across her time-traveling adventures, she
managed to maintain quite a serious long-distance relationship with a postman whilst running across time from one apocalypse to another.
While it's clear that she's just grilling Loki a bit by giving him a nonsense answer, this sounds too similar to a specific movie to be a coincidence. That movie being 1997's The Postman, directed, produced by, and starring Kevin Costner. Here, Costner portrays a drifter who, wearing a postman's uniform and carrying a mail bag, starts to inspire hope in the survivors of a post-apocalyptic Earth in the year 2013. Considering last episode's shoutout to David Fincher's Seven from 1995, the reference to the Marvel 2099 line of comics, and Agent Mobius's love of Josta Cola, it's starting to look like Loki showrunner Kate Herron has quite a bit of love for the 90s that she likes to cram into every episode. Even if The Postman flopped hard and managed to go and win itself a Razzie that year. Oh, and for extra fun, Postman also happens to be the name of an obscure Marvel Comics mutant who served as leader of the Chicago brand of sewer-dwelling Morlocks. Yeah, I just figured I'd throw that in there. So, are we just going by an episode 4 is where we put the big shakeup rule now? WandaVision showed us the sword base, Falcon and the Winter Soldier got very violent all of a sudden, and now everything we've been told about the TVA and the Timekeepers in Loki turns out to have been a lie. But hey, don't worry about all of that for now. Amidst all these topsy-turvy time-travel-y twists, there are still a few little extra details that warrant an extra look. And we are more than happy to go through them with you right now. Let's start off with a super quick one. Now, we've already gone over how Mobius' superior, Ravonna Renslayer, gets her name from the comic book character the same name, originally a princess on an alternate 40th century Earth who was the subject of affection of the time-traveling supervillain Kang the Conqueror. But here, we get to see her in her early TVA days as one of the hunters that callously arrest a young Sylvie. And sure enough, like any other hunter, she has a number, A23. Now take a wild guess what comic Ravonna first appeared in. If you guessed Avengers number 23, which lines up neatly with her designated hunter number, you've earned yourself a Josta Cola. Now, we've already seen that the TVA sometimes deals with some pretty wild stuff when it comes to variants. And I still want to know the full story behind the Tour de France and Hulk Lokis, by the way. And Mobius makes that clear once more when he's bewildered that the TVA can't keep track of just 2 Lokis. After all, according to him, they've dealt with things like Kree, Titans, and vampires before, so why should this be so difficult? Now, we already know who the Kree are, and Titans most likely refers to the inhabitants of Thanos' home planet of Titan, but we haven't yet seen any vampires in the MCU. Only heard the occasional joke about them. However, Blade, Marvel's resident vampire hunter, is slated to get his own MCU movie starring Mahershala Ali, who is taking over from Wesley Snipes' beloved portrayal of the character from back at the turn of the millennium. So maybe that's what Mobius is referring to? It certainly seems like the most obvious shout-out, but who knows? It might also refer to Morbius the Living Vampire, who is also getting his own movie from Sony early next year. After all, Morbius was originally a Spider-Man foe, and with the coming of an MCU multiverse and all the cameo rumors surrounding not just Spider-Man No Way Home, but also the upcoming Venom sequel, it's not completely impossible. He was also the one who gave Blade vampiric powers in the comics and turned him into a daywalker, so perhaps Morbius turning himself into a living vampire is a Nexus event? It's all just guesswork. I just kind of want to see Owen Wilson fighting time-traveling vampires. Hey, someone out there, make it happen. Hey look, it's Sif! Oh, we haven't seen her in a hot minute. Oh, and here she is, just kneeing Loki in the groin on repeat for hours on end. Oh, I don't envy our dear trickster god on this one. While he did bring it on himself by cutting her hair off for a joke, as he explains in the episode, I don't want to imagine what she'd be doing to him if he had cut off all of it like he did in the myth that this little interaction is based on. See, in the original Norse myths, Sif, who was Thor's wife by the way, had long, flowing golden blonde hair that she took great care of and was considered one of the most beautiful women in Asgard because of it. Until Loki cut it all off for a cheap laugh while she slept, leaving her completely bald. Now, I don't think I have to tell you that Thor and Sif got pretty mad about it, and Loki quickly promised to get the dwarves, known as the Sons of Ivaldi, to craft her a whole new head of hair made from actual gold. And just because Loki always has to be extra, in that same story, he also managed to trick two other dwarves, Brokkr and Atri, into making even more treasures for the Asgardians, including a little throwing weapon you might have heard of called Mjolnir. So actually, cutting off Sif's hair turned out pretty well for everyone involved back in the myths. In the MCU, though, oh yeah, this definitely seems like the more realistic reaction to cutting off someone's hair in their sleep. So maybe don't do that if you value your dangly parts. I shouldn't have to tell you to stick around for the credits in an MCU production by now, but oh boy, I really hope you did this time and didn't just end the episode on Loki getting pruned because, well, I mean, that's just depressing. Before we talk about the really cool part of the end credits, though, we have to talk about how Loki, as he wakes up from his pruning in what appears to be a post-apocalyptic New York City, if that busted-up Avengers Tower is anything to go by, asks if he has just died and gone to hell. And no, he doesn't mean the double hockey stick one, he means hell with just one L, known in Norse mythology as the land of the dead. See, the Vikings believed that if they died a worthy death in battle, their souls would ascend to Asgard and live in either the Great Hall of Valhalla or the Meadow of Folkvanger, destined to aid the gods in battle when Ragnarok comes. But if they were cowardly and dishonorable or died of things like sickness or old age, their souls would instead go to the much more dull and dreary Hell. Hel also happens to be the original name of Hela, who in myth was actually Loki's daughter and ruled over this realm, though she was not really the goddess of death as many misconstrue her to be. Now, why would Loki worry about ending up there, you ask? Because it seems to also be where Asgardians go when they die, as was the case with Baldur, another son of Odin, who both in myth and in comics got killed thanks to yet another one of Loki's escapades. Okay, now are you ready for the really cool part of the post-credits scene? Then feast your eyes on this. Boom! 4 more Lokis, baby. That's right, it looks like pruning doesn't actually kill people, but rather sends them to another desolate world, where Loki is quickly met with a bunch of other variants. And all of them are pretty notable, aside from just providing one of the story's cooler twists so far. For one, we have this cool old fellow over here wearing not just a classic comics Loki costume, but actually the exact costume that Loki wore way back in Journey into Mystery number 85 in 1962, his first appearance in Marvel Comics. Between this and the WandaVision Halloween episode, someone working on the Marvel TV shows is clearly having fun recreating the classic Bronze Age costumes. Then there's this much younger Loki, a Kid Loki, if you will. In the comics, Kid Loki was the reborn and much more morally conflicted form of Loki, created after the original sacrificed himself during the Siege events, when Norman Osborn and the Dark Avengers invaded Asgard. And then there's this guy, and boy does he raise a lot of questions. At first glance, he doesn't seem to be based on anything from the comic books. And is that Mjolnir he's holding? To make things more interesting, the credits list him as Boastful Loki. Now there's a story to this one, and I want to know all of it. Oh, and last, but most certainly not least, there's this guy. Oh, look at him, he's so cute. I'm gonna call him Bitey. No, Crocodokey. Is it me, or can Loki just not catch a break, regardless of where he fits in the time streams or multiverses or whatever we're gonna call them next? When he isn't getting killed by a big purple alien, he's getting arrested by time police, and then he bounces around a few apocalypses before getting pruned in front of his only allies. It's tough to be a god, as 2 wise men once said. But hey, at least these reality-bending shenanigans give us some Easter eggs to check out. Let's go! Oh, you know it's an Easter egg extravaganza when we can't even make it past the title, Journey into Mystery, without running into a comics reference. See, in the 1950s, when Marvel was still known as Atlas Comics, one of their titles was the horror anthology series Journey into Mysteries, which would feature a selection of short, creepy stories in each issue. Over time, as various real-world events and the Marvel rebranding happened, the focus of said stories shifted first into science fiction and later into featuring superheroes. And you guys are smart cookies, so I'm sure you can guess what famous Marvel superhero originated here. Yep, you got that right. Thor, the God of Thunder himself, debuted in issue number 83 of this very magazine back in 1962, with his adopted brother Loki following only 2 issues later. And oh boy, have these two gone on some mysterious journeys since. I know we like to joke about Disney consuming every property they buy, but no, that's not the spirit of Mufasa you see in the Void Sky, and it's not the Cave of Wonders either. Although, alligator Loki biting off another Loki's hand certainly seems to have some Peter Pan vibes. Anyway, as the Loki variants are eager to explain, this is a creature called Alioth, and just like here, he is bad news in the comics. To put it as simply as possible, Alioth the Usurper, as he's known, was the first creature to free himself from the constraints of time, and managed to conquer billions of years more than even the time-based villain Kang the Conqueror, who generally steered clear of Alioth, and even set up a barrier to keep him out of his helmet. Ravonna Renslayer, or at least her comics version, later had to deal with Alioth herself, so it probably shouldn't be too surprising to see him turn up in this show, all things considered. Okay, knowing that the Void is basically the TVA's personal trash heap of time-displaced people and objects, one should expect to find all sorts of goodies in the rubble. And boy, is there plenty! Sharp-eyed viewers are likely to spot a fair few MCU knickknacks and a few references to story events in the comics, and frankly, it's almost easier just to list them outright than go into detail with every single one, so I think I will. Among the rubble, one can find Yellow Jacket's helmet, Red Skull's plane, the wreck of the Dark Aster from Guardians of the Galaxy, the wreck of the Helicarrier, a statue of the Marvel Comics character known as the Living Tribunal, and most hilariously, a bright yellow helicopter with the word Thanos proudly written on the side, which, believe it or not, is actually from the comics. Spidey Super Stories number 39 to be exact, where the Mad Titan makes his getaway after stealing the Cosmic Cube in nothing less than his very own patented Thanos-copter. This thing is so ridiculous that it's become infamous, and not only did it pop up again in recent years in Deadpool, it's also a selectable vehicle in LEGO Marvel Avengers, and got itself a Hot Wheels toy in 2016. On a more serious note, you can also spot Stark Tower with the word Kang written on it, referencing Kang Enterprises, who Tony Stark once sold the tower to in the comics. Kang Enterprises was owned by one Mr. Griffin, who was actually Kang the Conqueror in disguise. That's 2 Kang references in this episode alone, and plenty of others across the series. Do you think maybe the real villain is... Nah, that's crazy, it couldn't be. And of course, since the show already referenced stuff like old energy drinks and the real-life plane hijacker D.B. Cooper, The Void wouldn't be complete without a few real-life mysteries thrown into the mix as well. Among the many things found in The Void is none other than the USS Eldridge, a Navy ship that was claimed to have been rendered completely invisible to enemy devices for a time back in 1943 in what is now referred to as the Philadelphia Experiment. That's widely believed to be a hoax, but hey, this is the MCU. Stranger things have happened. Hell, many strange things happen every minute of every episode of this show. Another urban legend pops up in the Loki variant's little hideout, where, among other treasures, gamers might spot a Polybius cabinet. For the uninitiated, Polybius is the name of a fabled 1980s arcade game that supposedly subjected whoever played it to strange psychoactive effects as part of some massive government-run experiment using the average gamer as their guinea pigs. It's one of the most famous urban legends in gaming circles, and hey, if we're gonna journey into mystery, then this box of bits and pixels feels right at home. Now, I know we're all utterly enamored with alligator Loki. I mean, just look at this big, strong boy in his widow pool. Oh, he's so cute. But he's not the only animal Asgardian the Void has to offer. Buried near the Loki's bunker, you might blink and miss the sight of an angry frog trying to break out of a glass jar with the number T365 on it. Well, that's no ordinary frog. It's Thor. In a famous story written by Walt Simonson called The Fight for Asgard, the God of Thunder managed to get himself turned into a frog and ended up getting mixed up in a war between frogs and rats in Central Park. Since he was still a worthy warrior, though, he retained his powers and briefly became Frog Thor before eventually turning back to his normal self. And the issue that this frog form first appeared? Why, Thor number 365, of course. That label wasn't just for show. It never is. That's actually not even the only frog Thor to exist in the comics. One of the frogs Thor met back then, Puddle Gulp, was actually a transformed human by the name of Simon Walterson. You see what they did there? Who much later down the line came into possession of a fragment of Mjolnir. This piece transformed into a miniature hammer called Frog-Mjolnir, and thus Puddle Gulp became Throg, the Frog of Thunder. I would say that you couldn't make this stuff up, but Walt Simonson and Jason Aaron did, somehow. Speaking of ridiculous things in this episode, that honest to God actually did happen in the comics, President Loki. That's right, the god of lies and mischief actually did run for president in a 4-issue 2016 miniseries titled Vote Loki as part of the then current all different, all new Marvel rebranding of the comic books. And he based his entire campaign on basically just being completely honest about what a scumbag he is and what kind of nasty things he's done over time. The series was intended as a satire of other instances where very obviously evil fictional characters have run for president of the United States and even managed to win. One of the biggest examples of this being none other than Lex friggin' Luthor over at DC Comics. Sadly, there was no Alligator Luthor around to bite off his hand at the time, much as we all would have loved to see that. Aluthigator. I'm never gonna get better than Crocodokey. And he wasn't even a crocodile! And just to close on a quick one, let's not leave Mobius out of the fun. Once you're done laughing at the little pizza car he's hauling Sylvie around in once they find each other in the void, take a closer look at the license plate. It reads GRN-W1D, which, if you squint, almost spells Grunwald, as in Marvel writer Mark Grunwald, who created a number of important Marvel characters such as John Walker, Lamar Hoskins, and the Flag Smashers who we got to know in the previous Marvel show Falcon and the Winter Soldier. Now, if that sounds familiar, that's because it's not the first time he's been referenced in the show. The opening scene of episode 2 wasn't set in Oshkosh just for giggles. It's where our dear friend Grunwald was born. Someone working on the show must be a fan, and really, with all he's contributed to the Marvel Universe, who can blame them? And that is Season 1, baby! After a grueling amount of time-based shenanigans and challenges, Loki and Sylvie have finally made their way beyond the void and all the way to the big gun behind it all, the true mastermind behind the TVA. And, as they quickly find out, so much more than just that. But who is this being truly? Is it Kang, like everyone's been theorizing? And more importantly, are there any Easter eggs to be found among all the new story reveals? Let's go find some. Alright, now this is almost too in your face to be a real Easter egg, but I have this nagging suspicion that if I don't bring it up, the comments will never let me hear the end of it, so here we go. As the episode begins, before we even get to see what lies beyond the void, we are given a little taste of the vastness of time, as several sound bites from characters all over the MCU are played over the usual Marvel Studios logo. But there are others in there too, from various corners of real-world history. Among these voices, you hear Maya Angelou, Greta Thunberg, Nelson Mandela, Malala Yousafzai, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, Neil Armstrong, and Alan Watts. It's almost like the wall of mentors from Soul. If there were fewer of them, and some of them were alive. So, not like that at all, actually. Moving on. Ever since episode 1 aired and audiences were introduced to the TVA and the Timekeepers, comic book fans have been bringing up the being known as He Who Remains. A man who, as the last survivor of the multiverse that came before the one we all currently know, created the Timekeepers to keep the timeline regulated as a sort of take-two after his former creations, the Time Twisters, turned more aggressive than anticipated. And sure enough, that is indeed who is waiting for Loki and Sylvie beyond the void. However, this seemingly jovial, omniscient fellow is a far cry from the withered, ancient being in the comics and seems to share more characteristics with, and hold on to your hats now, Kang the Conqueror. Now, we know that the time-dominating supervillain has been referenced multiple times throughout the show so far, and that it doesn't seem like he turned out to be the final villain like some folks predicted, but I swear we're not trying to pull a Mephisto here. There are details that line up pretty well, such as claiming to be born in the 31st century, whereas Kang was born in the 30th in the comics, a change that was probably made to line up with the comics being released in the 20th century, while this show was released in the 21st. But, most tellingly, he refers to himself as a conqueror when he brings up the many things people have called him over time. And really, he did sort of conquer time, though he ended up strictly regulating it rather than ruling individual eras with an iron fist like Kang. And this diversion from the main Kang does bring another character to mind. The Marvel Comics have no shortage of characters that, in one way or another, regulate, attempt to conquer, or generally work with the very fabric of time and reality itself. And one of those beings would be Immortus. Now, why am I bringing up this guy and his doofy-looking helmet? Well, let's take a second to look at what He Who Remains tells us about his origin story. That he was a scientist who discovered alternate timelines only for all of his variants to end up waging war, making him decide to regulate time to prevent a more evil version of himself from doing far worse. Now, to skip like a lot of convoluted details from the comics, one version of Kang eventually grew tired of being a time conqueror and constantly getting his butt kicked by various superheroes and retreated to a realm beyond time called Limbo. This is where the Timekeepers later found him and offered him immortality in exchange for making him the guardian and administrator of time for an 80 millennia time span. Thus, Immortus works to keep the timeline stable and regulated, pruning away the chronal branches as a gardener of time, to use the younger Kang's own words. Now that does sound a lot like what the MCU version of He Who Remains is doing, even though the pecking order between him and the Timekeepers has been reversed. Oh, and the fact that he's wearing a purple cape, a primarily green outfit, and a golden crest on his chest sure don't hurt the comparison either. Probably should have led with that. Oh no, we're not done with Kang just yet. Now, going back to He Who Remains' story of meeting several versions of himself, it brings to mind how there have been a few groups of Kang variants in the comics. One of these consisted of 3 different Kangs, led by the Prime Kang, and simply called themselves the Council of Kangs. And no, Rick and Morty fans, the Council of Ricks didn't come up with the multiversal councils first. Anyway, turns out the creation of this council was a ruse by Immortus, who attempted to trick Prime Kang into destroying all his other variants so that he could ensure that his existence as Immortus remained unthreatened. And then there's a second Council of Kangs, this time giving themselves the even longer title of the Council of Cross-Time Kangs. But these guys weren't actually imposters. A group of various beings who had defeated the robot doubles Kang used to govern over their individual realities, only to then take their equipment and disguise themselves as him in an attempt to acquire a powerful weapon and take out the Prime Kang. Not that it went too well for them, since Prime Kang eventually, more or less, fed them to Goliath. Whoops. Oh, and I would be remiss not to mention the Kang Collective, consisting of Kangs from various realities rather than timelines, one of whom was a kangaroo, named Kangaroo the Conqueror. And you know, my only question regarding that is, when are Kangaroo the Conqueror and Alligator Loki getting their own movie? Yeah, get on that, Marvel. The public demands it. And of course, we can't talk about Kang without also talking about Ravonna Renslayer, depicted here as the dutiful leader of the TVA, clinging to the idea that there must be a good reason behind all the lies. Ravonna's story in the comics as the subject of Kang's affections has led to her having almost as convoluted a career as Kang himself. Many different time-divergent versions of her have gone by many, many names. These include Terminatrix, Temptress, and Revelation. And heck, she's even taken the name Kang for herself here and there. But one of these many names show up in the episode, ready to be spotted by keen-eyed viewers. Knowing that all TVA employees in this show were originally variants, we do get to see a glimpse of Ravonna's former life as a school teacher in Ohio in 2018, and a look at her diploma reveals her name to be Rebecca Tourmanet. Now, this is the same name used by one version of Ravonna who managed to drag herself and Kang to the early 1900s to live out relatively normal, equal lives as the married couple Rebecca Tourmanet and Victor Timely, as opposed to their usual temporal power struggles. Terminatrix, Tourmanet, I bet that name took her like a whole 5 minutes to come up with. Okay, I've said Kang so many times now that it's starting to lose all meaning. So let's wrap this video up with a smaller but still interesting detail. As Loki and Sylvie enter He Who Remains' citadel, we see statues of the Timekeepers. But you may notice that there's a fourth pedestal and a broken statue on the floor. This is because while the Timekeepers are known as a trio, He Who Remains actually did originally create 4 Timekeepers in the comics. However, one was banished to ancient Egypt, took up the identity of the Oracle of Siwa, and had a brief encounter with the Fantastic Four. Since He Who Remains created them as a ruse in the MCU continuity, it seems unlikely that there's a 4th Timekeeper running around anywhere, or anyone I guess, but it's still a nice nod to the comic books. Knowing that there will be a 2nd season of Loki and that the 3rd Ant-Man film is set to feature even more time junk if the title Quantumania is anything to go by, we'll be right here to sniff out if, or rather when, Loki and the TVA pop back up.